to get anywhere on the ladder and end up, living at home on the internet all the time. Those people now will have a fund. I think it's £9,000, to spend on education, so they can get out of that vicious spiral, downward spiral people are trapped in. This is very, very good news that they're discussing, and I sincerely hope that they get elected and that policy can be implemented. So congratulations to everyone involved in that. I, as a former adult education lecturer for nearly 10 years, I know how important it is. Adult education, I'm a perpetual student as well as a teacher. I am an adult educator and a perpetual lifelong student. So this idea of a lifelong learning fund is incredibly important, and I think everyone should be able to access that funding. I haven't looked at all the details, I will do, and if I can think of ways to improve it, I'll write to them. I also want to honour and acknowledge the fact that David Cameron has finally popped his head up over the trenches. Oh dear, David. A lot of people in Britain thought that man had a sense of morality. There was a sort of inner sense of truthfulness and right speaking about him. You felt way back in the days of the coalition government, when he and Nick Clegg were running the country, you felt, or at least I did, and I know many of my friends did, that they were kind of getting us on the right path. I felt that he was a man that one could trust his word, and I did correspond with him. I had replies, we had a sort of correspondence going on. And finally, you see, I think he should have been campaigning against Brexit for the last 3 years. I think that within a week of that, he should have, sort of come out against Brexit. But it's only now that he's doing so, having just about to publish his memoirs about the whole origins of the Brexit catastrophe. Well, better late than never. Well done, David. You're finally telling the truth. You're telling us with 100% facts that Boris Johnson is a liar. He is a mendacious politician who, according to David Cameron, was never strongly for Brexit. He made a strategic decision to back it simply for his own career advancement. This is an egotist, a supreme egotist, who only cares about his own self-advancement. Now, the world can't afford to let such egotists get away with it. We're only going to survive as a planet if enough of us are prepared to surrender ego to spiritual wisdom and truth, which works for the universal good. This is what the Mahayana Buddhist position is, that you don't even go for just personal enlightenment, as if Boris has even never heard of the word. You go for collective universal enlightenment. So you surrender even your possibility of going to nirvana in order to help everyone else get there. And the best way to do that is transform the planet into nirvana, which Buddhists call the Shambhala kingdom. This is a vow I took as a bodhisattva. When I was 19 and first discovered Tantra Tibetan Buddhism, it was like, that's what I'm doing this lifetime. I woke up, remembered. So egotism is the force that blocks that progress, that spiritual progress. And unfortunately, when politicians become supreme egotists, like Donald Trump, I'm afraid to say, is another example, it's all about me, me, me. And no wonder he likes Boris Johnson, because he recognises another me, me, me guy. I'm afraid to say Erdogan strikes me a bit of like that. Netanyahu certainly does. We can't afford these people. They will wreck the planet, This is serious stuff, because they have access to nuclear weapons now. And mass killing and God knows what. And fake propaganda and internet warfare and demonisation of anyone that speaks out against their ego. This is what bad rulers have always done throughout history. Tyrants. They have their spies out listening. Anyone that speaks against them, is found mysteriously dead. Well, sorry, we had an enlightenment in Europe. We got rid of that way of thinking, and we introduced the ideas of constitutional government and liberal democracy, and we have to go back to basics to rethink that. Hang on, we don't want these kind of egotistical tyrants around. So bless him, David Cameron is blowing the whistle, and he's now come out and said he thinks we probably need a second referendum. Well, David, welcome, join the club. I hope he stands as a Liberal Democrat candidate at the next election. He would he would make a good Liberal Democrat MP. He always used to get up and say he stood for liberal values when he was asked why he supported the European Union. He never said, I stand for conservative values, He always used to use, if you watch the speeches, I stand for liberal values. I think he'd make an excellent Liberal Democrat candidate, and he's a clever man and young enough to still do some good. But, anyway, his book will be very interesting, and I think will put the nail in the coffin of the Boris Johnson, Farage, etc., the lunatics who've taken over the asylum. I think, personally, David Cameron shouldn't have resigned as an MP. I think he should have... Anyway, there's no point discussing. I think he should have had a second referendum there and then. I think the first referendum was ill thought through. It should have had a cap on it. Like 60% had to vote in favour of this in all 4 countries of the UK for it to pass. The fact that he's revealed he used to get totally stoned and off his head on cannabis, that's probably why he didn't think that through. Maybe there's some parts of the grey cells weren't functioning. And I have nothing wrong with, students enjoying that. But when it comes to hard politics, you seriously have to think through all the consequences, like a chess player. He didn't, bless him. So better late than never. Join the Bremain group, David, and I look forward to reading your memoirs with great interest. As I say, the Supreme Court decision coming up about the prorogation of Parliament is incredibly important. It's coming up on Tuesday this week. In a few days' time, I'm going to be watching with great interest. I just want to add a little druidical aside, which is the judges of the Druid community of Ireland and Wales and Britain in the old days. In Ireland, they're called the Brehon judges. Brehon is an old Irish Gaelic term meaning to bear, as in to bear bad news, or to bear a child. To bear, to carry, to hold. If you bear something, and in this case it's you bear the weight of making a difficult decision about, did this person commit murder? Did that person get raped? Judges have huge responsibilities on their shoulders. They bear a lot of karma, if you want. And so that's why they were called the Brehons. And it was you couldn't be a Brehon unless you're also a Druid. But not all Druids then trained and became specialised in law. Not every Druid became a Brehon. Some Druids became a historian or an artist of the collective memory, the storytelling, and so on, or the spiritual rituals, the religious rites. But those Druids that trained as Brehons took it extremely seriously, and what they asked of cases was, does this conform to, the ultimate dharma of truth, this case? And they looked at all the case precedents. It was all oral law. Brehon law was oral. It wasn't about writing down. They didn't use writing because that can be easily cheated. And they weighed it in the heart. So I hope that our judges at the Supreme Court will weigh the Brehon tradition of looking at events through cosmic eyes, and realise that this Prime Minister has broken every single possible ethical rule by proroguing Parliament. And I believe and hope and pray that they will cancel that decision and declare it illegal, unsound and invalid, and that the result of that will be that Parliament will simply be recalled, and we can see John Bercow and the gang, Joanna Cherry, all the heroes of the Bremain resistance movement, reoccupy Parliament effectively, out of which they've been closed and shut out by illegal shenanigans from the Conservatives, who don't have a majority in Parliament anymore. This man, Boris Johnson, does not have actually the support of the House of Parliament. So his solution, dreamt up by his evil genius Dominic Cummings, is, we'll shut Parliament down. It's unbelievable. And I hope this court, do their job and earn their pay grade. And Lady Arden of Heswell and Lord Briggs of Westbourne and Lord Kitchen and all the rest of them, actually speak up for truth and justice. So I want to now just talk a little more philosophically, because as you know, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a politician, I'm simply a philosopher with certain, interests in the history of political ideas, profound interest in that. I've written about it. I'm also interested, as you know, in spirituality, and we yesterday had the Council of British Druid Orders meeting in London. I run the Druid Order that deals with peace negotiations, mediation. In the tradition of those early Brehons, the Druids were always the peacemakers, not just in Ireland, but throughout Gaul, which was a strongly Druidical area, and also throughout Switzerland, Austria, Belgium, all down the Rhine Valley. That was Druid territory, up until not just before, up until the Roman conquest, really. And then later the Germanic tribes, tried to take over and pretend it was Germanic territory. It was Celtic, actually. Although the Germanic and Celtic tribes were quite close, and their cosmologies, the old rune masters and the Druids, there's a lot of toing and froing. We're about to have a European Druid Council meeting in Lindau in Bavaria, and then in Austria, Feldkirch. So anyone that's interested, can come along if you're a Druid and you're committed to peace. And it's very interesting to look through contemporary events through the Druid perspective, because, in the old days, these kind of people that were mendacious and told lies just simply didn't get accepted. They didn't advance to positions of status in society, because an oral society depends on your honour, your word, your bond, your truth. And in fact, in Anglo-Saxon, word, to give somebody your word, meant you gave them your life force, your energy, because the Anglo-Saxon word for a human being is a word. Word. And that's what I am, my word, right? And Wordald is the place of mankind, humanity. It's the place where we share our common word. That's an interfaith project sponsored by colleagues at the University of Cambridge with the help of the King of Jordan. We share a common word here. In theology, we can call it the common logos. Heraclitus talked about this. And in the Christian sacraments, the breaking of the bread is a symbol of the common word we share, the universal logos in which we all partake. Well, that truth that lives within us all, we break asunder when we lie to anybody, be it our personal friend, spouse, students, anybody. And the higher you are up the chain of power, the more responsibility you have to be scrupulous in truth-telling, in my opinion, in the old Druid system of the Celts, because their whole civilization depended on being able to trust your Druid. If Druids are misbehaving, doing the wrong thing, lying, they wouldn't last 2 seconds among the Druid community. It took 20 years to be a Druid. And you could blow it through mendacity and evil. So, from that perspective, the actions of these politicians like Trump and Johnson is truly shocking. And all I can say as an archdruid from European perspective is we have to recall them that the fundamental trust between government and governed is premised on this truth bond, if you want. Now that's why I proposed back in 2015, and I wrote to David Cameron and Nick Clegg about it, and the opposition leaders, that all parliamentarians should swear an oath of veracity. I come back to this again and again as a political philosopher and druid, that's the only way to clear up this mess. If parliamentarians swore on taking office, they will only tell the truth about all matters of state business and important policy, not about their personal dietary habits or even their personal stuff. No, political important matters of policy and state. If they're discovered to have lied, they lose office immediately, because lying should not be tolerated among people that we pay out of taxpayers' money to be our representatives and to be the instruments of the collective will through a democratic polity. So, if you haven't read that Duty of Veracity bill, I even drafted it for my colleagues. And I hope that in the next Parliament, which I hope will be a very reforming Parliament after the next general election, that some, reform-minded MPs will look at this and say, wow, this is what we need to adopt. I think it should be done on like day 2, because how else can we trust the word of these political leaders set to rule over us? I want to also address this other question. Why does it matter? Why bother about truth so much, Thomas? Look, the world's corrupt, it's all fallen, people get on in life by lying. You can't reverse that. You're just one voice blowing in the wind, Why does it matter so much? Well, I also want to say that I'm also a Christian, right? And I was baptised at King's College at the University of London as an undergraduate student. I swore an oath before God that I would fight for the forces of light against the same forces that had killed Christ, the same forces that sought to destroy that word. I'm talking about this common word. Well, Christ embodied that to me as a great teacher, a great, sage, if you want. In Hindu terms, an avatar, a messiah. I don't care what label you use. He was someone that was prepared to speak truth to power. And whether it was the local rabbi council that were prosecuting him because he didn't have the right qualifications, or the local Roman army that was grumbling because he was teaching peace and they depended on war. He he annoyed enough people that they eventually came after him. And but it didn't stop him. He carried on speaking this truth thing, and then even death didn't stop him. You see, I've got to take my hat off at this point because, that was a serious miracle, the resurrection. Now I know some people say, well, it was, like he didn't really die on the cross. Well, okay, to me that still counts as a miracle. You tried being stuck up with nails on a cross for several hours and you survive. I still think that's a miracle. Anyway, the point is, his message then got out, and it was spread by his disciples and apostles and Mary Magdalene and Thomas and John, who I regard as the wisest of his disciples. I like Matthew as well. He was a great guy. Peter, I don't think, was an intellectual. I love Peter, but he didn't have the subtlety of the inner nuances of Christ's teachings, which was a bit of a problem. But anyway, he did his best, right? So we have this thing called Christianity. All around where I live in France here, these are beautiful churches. So what's the point of that? In England, we have many, many beautiful churches. I've sat and prayed in many of them. I've been to many of the great cathedrals. Are they just symbols of some forgotten thing? We should put them in a museum? No. We should, as a culture, as a Christian civilization in Europe and Britain, honour that tradition that we've inherited, which depends on truth, depends on righteousness. It depends on following the inner law. Now, the point that I was making about Druids believing in the inner law is exactly the same in Christianity. This is why the Druids of Ireland, Britain and Gaul became Christian, because they resonated with Christ's work. What Christ said is, look, there's all these scriptures you can quote me about, what Abraham said and what Moses said and all the written commandments. But before Abraham was, I am, he said. In other words, I'm speaking from a place of spiritual depth, anterior to the writing systems that you're quoting at me. Jesus was an inspired prophet who I believe had inherited the wisdom of the early Kabbalist traditions, the Enochian traditions of esoteric Judaism. He was a master of esoteric, spiritual, ecumenical universalism from before it splits into religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Christ would come back and wouldn't say, I'm Jewish or Christian or Muslim. He'd say, no, I'm speaking from the place of universal gnosis, and please, come and join us. And from that perspective, having politicians that lie and cheat and steal and misrepresent is very, very important, because from that kind of perspective we can't afford to be other than truthful. I mean, as a philosopher, I'm pledged to search for absolute truth. That's why I've written loads of books about the philosophy of truth, and my book Being and Knowledge goes into that in huge detail. But if we have politicians that are lying, they're threatening the very existential integrity of the planet, the ontology of being, is being threatened by its lack of knowledge. So my book, Being and Knowledge, is incredibly important. I hope you study it. It's about this fractured and difficult relationship between being, which is, we all love to be, it's great, and knowledge, which we also have to do. It's our two primary things. If people fake the knowledge, or misuse it, or misapply it, or distort it and lie, then we're renamed. We're no longer Homo sapiens, we're Homo ignorans. And Homo ignorans is going to destroy being. We self-destruct, because knowledge, the truth, is at the core of what our being is. So that's a kind of complicated philosophical position I put forward in my book, which you can read if you're into deep philosophical studies. But in a nutshell, it's also what Christianity was saying. You know, if you crucify truth, you're in serious trouble. And what I'm saying, therefore, is that why this Brexit thing matters, and why I'm fighting hard to retain the integrity of Britain's role within the wider European civilized community, is because it's about truth against lies. Okay, so yeah, but why does that matter? Why not just accept that there's always been wars, there's always been violence? I mean, look, they killed Christ, you know, why? How can you do any better? Well, I'm committed also to peace. As a peace scholar and a peace philosopher, I'm saying that we, the small people of the world, can, if we unite our voices, and we can use things like the internet and so on, we can drown out the small, dark elite of military industrial espionage experts who are vastly wealthier than we are, and misusing that wealth for weapons of war and for warfare. So I believe, this is why I like the European project. It's a peace project. The European Union won the Nobel Peace Prize, for God's sake. And that's why I'm canvassing for the European Union Mediation Service, to be set up as an official body within the European Union. It will happen, I assure you. And I'd love it to happen sooner rather than later. It would be staffed by experts in mediation and conflict resolution studies. You know, young, budding diplomats that would go to the European Union could service it and then go and help mediate conflicts around either within European states, like in Spain, or a Catalan culture, or conflicts like on its borders, like Ukraine and so on, or the Mediterranean region. Huge number of things need sorting. Palestine, Israel comes to mind, Syria, Kurdish problems with Turkey and so on. Now, the European Union Mediation Service would be scrupulously neutral. It would be sworn to the highest degrees of civil service impartiality and truthfulness. And again, you wouldn't get to work in it if you lied. The minute you told the lie, you'd be sacked. And my veracity bill should apply to all European Union officials and parliamentarians, by the way, obviously. So this is all very exciting, and that's why I believe in this European project. And if I've been doing some research recently, and I decided it's time to set up some kind of like a philosophy society for I call it the Philosophical Society for Liberal Democracy. You know, if these are the values that we believe in as a European civilization, then we need to remember them and celebrate them. We can't grumble about the Steve Bannon types coming in and saying, no, Mussolini was a great guy, let's all worship Hitler, let's all do extreme right stuff, let's do, let's go back and do warfare and World of Warcraft type games. These people are ignorant, but we can't, there's no point just cursing the darkness. As I think it was Rumi said, the sage also lights the candle in his hand instead of cursing the darkness. So I'm announcing here the formation of a Philosophical Society for Liberal Democracy. And our mission is to articulate, research, in some ways resurrect this forgotten heritage that I was taught at the University of London. When I read my history degree, we did political ideas. It was my favourite part of the course. We studied in the hall named after William Beveridge, one of the great heroes of liberal thinking, who was a member of the Liberal Party and who brought in the welfare state. He was a close friend of Winston Churchill, who trusted him with that mission. And Winston Churchill began his life as a Liberal MP. Most people forget that. He was never a hard right-wing Tory. He was a Liberal Democrat conservative like Cameron. and like these other people that are flocking out of the Tory party into the Liberals. It's the tradition, I think, of Kant and Montesquieu, who were great figures of the Enlightenment, who said, let's have human rights balanced with social responsibilities. And the purpose, the goal of it is peace. It was Kant that dreamed up the European Union all those centuries ago, because he was a rational thinker. He worked out that is the only way to go. And he was a great philosopher of duty. He invented this concept in ethics called deontology, which is that there are some things you just have to do. They're not like questionable. And you don't do it because of self-interest, like in utilitarian thinking. You do it because it's a duty. And he believed ultimately that ethics is underpinned by divine wisdom, by God. I agree 100% with Kant. So let's revive our studies. But I also revere the work of Beccaria, who was the great jurist from Italy, who first off said that if people have done crimes, yes, they need to be punished, but the point isn't for society to extract sadism and revenge, it's to re-educate them so that they don't do these crimes again. He was the first guy to say maybe the death penalty isn't such a good idea because it's going to fill the afterlife with very stupid people. Let's re-educate them whilst we can, put them in prison, and if they seriously reform and repent, then let them out, to have meaningful lives. And so drawing on the work of all these great thinkers, Bentham, John Stuart Mill, Croce, the great Italian liberal thinker. I'm so pleased the Italians have got rid of their extreme right. Looney, who's been threatening civil order in Italy. He's been doing a sort of Brexit nonsense, this man Salvini. He's gone. Croce was the greatest liberal intellectual of 20th century Italian politics, to my mind, and a great expert on Hegel, and a literary critic and a genius. The Italian soul is worth so much more than the kind of Salvini populism. And so thank God, welcome back to civilization, Italy. And may the spirit of Croce live on. And Beccaria. And also Hegel, who was an enlightened thinker. And that's why I love his work. And, would put myself in some sort of Hegelian tradition, philosophically speaking. And so, in my work, Being and Knowledge, obviously I've gone into huge detail on all that. Gladstone is another of my heroes, who was probably the most learned Prime Minister our country ever had. He was a scholar, he was a Greek expert, a Hellenist. He wrote loads of books about Homer and stuff. And he was a Christian, a profound, deep, genuine Christian. That's why he felt that Ireland should have, a measure of self-government, and that the Irish Catholic Church should no longer be persecuted. And, he was liberal in his attitude to Ireland. And Gladstone also left his library at St Daniel's Library to the nation. It's now St Daniel's Library, where you can go and study, and I recommend people to have a little holiday in Wales and go there. I organised a conference on 9/11 in December 2001 in that place. And so there's a whole tradition of liberal thinkers we can draw on for this work. Von Ranke, the great German historian, is another, the great idealist. I include Max Muller and the circle of Bunsen, who was the German ambassador at the court of Queen Victoria, and the Duke of Argyll, who was an intellectual searching for reconciling science with spirituality. They were friends of Queen Victoria. Lord Acton is another hero of mine intellectually, a great historian. I would include also, the great 20th century world historian Toynbee, one of the intellectual influences on my work as a historian, a world historian. So my idea of transpersonal history is just building on from the ideas of von Ranke and Toynbee and people. And then French thinkers like Thiers and Condorcet. Condorcet is a tragic figure who was a genius of the Enlightenment. He supported the moderate liberal phase of the revolution, like many intelligent people, but he opposed the extremist, radical, violent phase of the revolution. and then he had to take flight because he was being pursued by Robespierre, who stands for that ignorant, violent radicalism that we can see later in Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot, this revolutionary, horrible extremism. And Condorcet was in fear of his life, he was hiding, and he wrote a book called On the Progress of the Human Race, which was a great philosophical treatise about how, in spite of everything, mankind will one day, live in a world in which we are guaranteed, the basic needs for our lives and enough for us to grow spiritually as well. Condorcet was a true philosopher. And then he was caught, and then he was executed and guillotined. So he was a genius, and so many geniuses were killed under the guillotine in France, and also later in Russia and in China, where Confucian scholars and so on were literally just bayoneted or chopped to death, and in Tibet. So my belief of liberal democracy is we're opposed to all that political violence. I was just reading a book about Tibet, where it was revealed by the author who went and studied there incognito, that the Chinese Communist Party engaged in what is called political cannibalism during the 1960s Cultural Revolution. I was shocked at this. I'd never even thought this is possible, but they actually had seen the Communist Party officials go and arrest people that were regarded as riffraff, i.e. intellectuals, teachers, people like me, and then they would serve them up at a banquet. They would chop up their livers and feed them as a kind of sign to the peasants to behave. And this was actually done in 1968 during the Cultural Revolution. Now the documentation is all in this book. It's called Tibet, Oh Tibet, by a man who used to run the Free Tibet campaign, whose name escapes me. But I was shocked. Obviously, I'm going to research the sources. But if it's true, as it appears to be true, he's a scholar, he wouldn't have published without the sources, and he gives them, then that sums up where we've got to as a planet. That's the kind of route of the not to be pursued path, political cannibalism. I have many complaints about that. And the liberal democratic tradition that I stand for and come from, this heritage of the European Enlightenment, is saying, on the contrary, that we should help each other and nourish each other and, like Christ, feed each other, not eat each other. There's two choices we've got in this world. We can either feed each other and help each other, or we can literally eat each other. And it seems to me the Brexit lobby and their kind of ilk are the political cannibals. Johnson, literally turned against his former friend David Cameron and chopped him up. So no, I'm sorry. We reject those kind of values. We reject political cannibalism, and the philosophical society for liberal democracy is going to exert every sinew of our collective neuronal power to think through solutions to, yes, the problems of the European Union, things like creating European Union Mediation Service, how to deal with bureaucracies and so on, people in entrenched positions that block them and don't do anything. But these are all sortable if the UK remains within the European Union. We can work together on this. If we allow these political cannibals to get away with their Brexit nonsense, then gosh, it's a nightmare. Okay, so I'm going to finish there. Thank you so much for listening. This has been my normal Sunday broadcast. It's September the 15th, the day of the Congress of Vienna, a city I know and love well. So let's hope that on this Tuesday, let's hope that Boris Johnson's putsch for blocking Parliament is reversed by the Supreme Court. And I will be sharing further updates on that. Thank you so much for listening.